The sound of screeching tires echoed in his mind, like a tape playing over and over again. Daniel opened his eyes, panting, heart racing. He stood on a deserted street, his hands trembling. The metallic smell of blood filled the air, but he couldn't tell where it was coming from. His shirt clung to his body, soaked with sweat, and when he looked down, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. His hands were covered in blood. "What happened?" he whispered, but the words barely came out. His mind was a blur of disconnected images, fragments of a night he couldn't fully remember. A distant scream snapped him out of the stupor, and when he turned, he saw a hospital far down the road. Laura. Her name echoed in his head, but he didn't know why. Something terrible had happened to her, and he needed to find her. Without thinking, he started running. The cold night air hit his face, but he couldn't feel it. All that mattered was reaching the hospital. As he got closer to the entrance, he saw paramedics rushing by, and amid the chaos, there she was, being wheeled in on a stretcher, unconscious. He tried to yell, but his voice failed him. Daniel pushed through the hospital's double doors, his feet heavy, fear tightening in his chest like a noose. Minutes later, he stood in front of a doctor, his face grim, hesitation clear in his expression. "I'm sorry, sir. We did everything we could." Those words crushed him. The world around Daniel darkened, the noise of voices and machines disappearing, transforming into a cold, suffocating void. Laura was dead. The only person he loved, the only reason he still clung to sanity, was gone. He couldn't accept it, he wouldn't accept it. Unable to protest or fight, he collapsed to his knees in the empty hallway, his face buried in his blood-stained hands. And in that moment, with his mind swallowed in despair, he remembered something: the watch. Amid the chaos of the last few days, he had bought a strange watch from an antique store. The seller had said it was special, but in the rush and impending grief, Daniel hadn't paid attention to the man's words. He pulled the watch from his pocket with trembling fingers. The cold metal seemed to pulse in his hands, as though it contained a power he didn't understand. The object almost glowed under the hospital's dim light. An irrational urge took over Daniel. What if this could save her? Without thinking about the consequences, he turned the watch's hand. Time around him seemed to warp, the hospital walls distorting like carnival mirrors. The sensation was nauseating, as if the very air around him had been ripped away. Suddenly, everything went dark. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying in bed. At home. Daniel sat up with a jolt, heart still racing. The room was shrouded in a familiar dimness. He looked around, trying to process what had just happened. The watch was still in his hand, but something was different. His mind wandered for a few seconds, until a sound from the hallway made him freeze. "Daniel?" It was Laura's voice, sweet and confused, echoing through the house. He could barely believe what he was hearing. He rushed to the living room, almost out of breath, and there she was, standing, alive, as if nothing had happened. Her eyes met his, and she smiled, unaware of the devastating pain he had just experienced. "Why are you looking at me like that?" She laughed, not knowing he had just seen her dead. Daniel felt the world spin beneath his feet. He had come back. 24 hours into the past. Unable to speak, he hugged her, too tightly, as though if he let go, she would vanish again. Laura returned the embrace but looked at him with concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" He couldn't explain, but he knew one thing: the watch worked. He had a second chance, but the fear persisted. What if it wasn't enough? That night, he didn't sleep. He sat next to Laura as she slept peacefully, her breathing soft and steady. Every second that passed reminded him of what was coming. Laura's death wasn't a dream. He had lived through it, and he knew it could happen again. Daniel held the watch in his trembling hand, his thoughts in turmoil. How could he stop her fate? More importantly, how far was he willing to go to save her? Daniel spent the next morning in a constant state of tension. Laura noticed his restlessness, but he couldn't explain it. How could he? The idea was absurd. I went back in time to save you. No one would believe him, least of all her. Every time he looked at the watch in his hands, a mix of relief and fear consumed him. What did he really know about it? Determined to find out more, Daniel grabbed the watch and headed straight to the antique shop where he had bought it. He remembered the place clearly, a small store in a narrow, dimly lit street. There was no visible sign, and the windows were always covered with heavy curtains. As he pushed open the door, the little bell above jingled softly. The air inside was thick, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. Mr. McKenna, the shop owner, stood behind the counter, as if he already knew Daniel would return. His calm, almost indifferent expression made Daniel's stomach twist. The man had a casual posture, but his eyes held deep, enigmatic knowledge. "I've been expecting you," McKenna said without lifting his head from what appeared to be an old ledger. He didn't seem surprised to see Daniel holding the watch, which only made him more uneasy. "What is this?" Daniel asked, more angrily than he intended. "What did you sell me?" The old man smiled slightly and looked up. "What you asked for, young man. A chance to correct a mistake. Daniel stepped closer to the counter, his gaze intense, but he felt the weight of fear growing in his chest. He was in unknown territory. This isn't normal. Going back in time? It can't be that simple. What's the catch? What am I not seeing? McKenna watched him for a moment, as if deciding how much he should reveal. Finally, he sighed, and Daniel got the sense that the old man had repeated these words countless times before. "The watch gives you a second chance," McKenna said calmly. "Every turn of the hand can take you back in time, but everything has a price, doesn't it?" Daniel frowned, feeling a chill run down his spine. "What price?" "A year of your life," McKenna answered bluntly. "Every time you turn the hand and go back in time, you lose a year of your life. That's the cost. It's how the watch keeps balance. You gain something, but lose something of equal value. Daniel leaned against the counter, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he just heard. A year of his life. Every time he used the watch, time moved forward for him, even though he went back in time to save Laura. But what if, Daniel hesitated. What if I need to use it multiple times? You'll age faster, of course, McKenna replied, leaning over the counter. And eventually, well, you might lose more than you're willing to sacrifice. The silence between them was heavy. Daniel felt the air get caught in his lungs. He looked down at the watch in his hands, so small and insignificant, yet it carried such immense power. Going back in time to save Laura had been the right choice, but he knew more accidents could happen, and maybe the illness she was hiding was beyond his control. If he used the watch again, he'd be shortening his own life. How far would he be willing to go? "I can't let Laura die," Daniel muttered, more to himself than to McKenna. The old shopkeeper smiled again, without any apparent judgment. "You're not the first to say that, young man. But remember, the more you try to change fate, the more it slips through your fingers. Daniel looked into McKenna's eyes, feeling the weight of each word. The watch was both a blessing and a curse. Saving Laura meant losing himself, piece by piece. Without another word, Daniel turned and left the shop, the watch still clenched tightly in his hand. Outside, the cool afternoon wind brushed against his face, but it was nothing compared to the storm swirling inside him. He walked slowly through the streets, watching the busy people go about their day, oblivious to the burden he carried in his pocket. They lived their lives normally, unaware of the power he held, and the weight that power carried. As he headed home, one question consumed him: what was he willing to sacrifice to save Laura? Maybe it was only a matter of time before he would have to use the watch again. And when that moment came, would he be ready to pay the price? That night, sitting beside Laura on the couch, watching her laugh at some TV show, Daniel felt the watch in his pocket, the cold metal burning against his skin. He knew this wouldn't end here. Fate never surrenders so easily. The following days were a blur of anxiety for Daniel. He became obsessed with the idea of saving Laura. Every time she left for work or something trivial, he felt a knot form in his stomach, waiting for disaster to strike again. The memory of seeing her, lifeless on the hospital stretcher, haunted him every night. And the more he tried to push those thoughts away, the more they consumed him. Each ring of the phone or unexpected news sent him into a state of panic. Daniel felt like he was losing control of his own mind. There was no escaping the fear that, at any moment, everything would happen again. He continued to carry the watch with him, never letting it out of his pocket. He felt its weight constantly, like a presence that kept him on the edge of an inevitable decision. How many years of life could he sacrifice before the price became too high? On the third morning, the phone rang while Daniel was making coffee in the kitchen. It was the hospital. Again. Mr. Anderson? The voice of a nurse sounded on the other end of the line. Your wife, Laura, has been in an accident. She's on her way to the hospital now. The coffee cup slipped from Daniel's hands, shattering on the floor. He heard the words, but they didn't register. No, not again. Without wasting a second, he grabbed his coat and ran to the hospital, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived, the scene was almost identical to the previous week, Laura being rushed in on a stretcher while the doctors worked to stabilize her. He ran to the doctor, Dr. Stevenson, who was on duty that morning. Is she going to be okay? The question came out as a strangled cry. Dr. Stevenson gave him a grave look. We're doing everything we can, but the accident was severe. Prepare for the worst. Daniel felt those words hit him like a punch. He couldn't let this happen again. Not now, not while he had the power to stop it. He rushed to the nearest bathroom, locking the door behind him, and pulled out the watch with shaking hands. Just one more time, he muttered to himself as he turned the hand. Suddenly, the familiar coldness washed over his body, and the world around him began to distort. The bathroom disappeared, and he was swallowed by the emptiness that came with time travel. When he opened his eyes again, he was at home, one day before the accident. The watch had worked again. He could still save Laura, and this time he knew exactly what to do. Prevention. He spent the entire day monitoring her every move, ensuring she avoided any potential danger. He canceled her plans, made up excuses to keep her at home, far away from the accident he knew was coming. With every passing minute, Daniel felt he was closer to ensuring her safety. That night, they sat together on the couch, and he finally allowed himself to breathe, believing he had succeeded this time. Laura, unaware of Daniel's tension, was relaxed, enjoying the evening with him. It seemed that the danger had passed. It seemed. But the next morning, when Laura went to the supermarket, the phone rang again. Mr. Anderson? It was the hospital. Your wife collapsed and was rushed here in an emergency. Daniel stood frozen, the words piercing his mind. Collapsed? This wasn't part of the accident. Something was wrong. this time, it wasn't an accident. He arrived at the hospital as quickly as possible. Dr. Stevenson was waiting for him, looking exhausted. She fainted suddenly at the supermarket, the doctor said seriously. We've stabilized her, but the tests revealed something you need to know. Daniel felt the ground drop out from under him. What does she have? He stammered, his voice faltering. Dr. Stevenson sighed. Laura has a serious heart condition. A disease she probably didn't know about, but now it's worsened. She's in critical condition, and we need to act quickly to save her life. But even with treatment, she may not survive. Daniel heard the words, but he couldn't fully grasp them. Reality was crashing down on him like a hammer. He had gone back in time to save her from an accident, only to find out that she was dying in another way. While the doctor continued talking, Daniel stood silent. It didn't matter how many times he tried to save Laura from accidents or external tragedies, the illness consuming her from the inside was inevitable. He couldn't stop her body's internal clock from running out. What do I do now? He murmured to himself as he looked at the watch that had brought him this far. The answer was clear, but terrifying. He would have to keep trying. He needed to stop her death, no matter the cost. That night, back at the apartment, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the watch as if it were his enemy. He held it tightly, knowing that this wasn't over. There was something bigger at play, something beyond his control. Laura's death seemed inevitable, but if there was even the smallest chance, he would take it. But the more Daniel used the watch, the clearer it became that he wasn't just controlling time. Time was controlling him. Daniel's apartment felt quieter than ever. The sound of Laura's slow, heavy breathing echoed from the next room. She was resting, as the doctors had ordered complete care. Her health was deteriorating, and Daniel knew that no matter how many accidents he avoided, the brutal truth was that her time was running out anyway. Once again, Daniel found himself hunched over the watch. The object, with its dull glow and antique design, felt heavier now, as if it carried the burden of all the years he had already sacrificed. How many years did he have left? Each time he traveled back, he felt more drained, older. Fine lines were starting to form on his face, and his vitality was slipping away, but he couldn't stop. Laura was everything to him, and letting her go was unimaginable. He needed answers. Something didn't make sense. No matter how hard he tried to save Laura, it seemed like the watch was only delaying the inevitable, not fixing the real problem. Determined to find out more, Daniel returned to the antique shop that afternoon. The bell above the door chimed, announcing his arrival, and Mr. McKenna was there, as always, waiting for him. Back so soon? Said McKenna without looking up from his book. Daniel didn't waste time. You didn't tell me everything, McKenna. It can't be just this, going back in time and losing years of life. Something more is going on. McKenna slowly raised his gaze, as if he had been waiting for that question. He sighed deeply and closed the book, leaning forward. You're right, Daniel. I didn't tell you everything, because you weren't ready to hear it. But tell me, what do you think is happening? Daniel was silent for a few seconds. McKenna's words weren't a confession, but an invitation. Daniel knew he was on the verge of discovering something bigger than he had expected. I feel like, no matter how much I try to change fate, something always pulls Laura back to the brink of death, as if it's a cycle I can't break. McKenna smiled faintly, a smile that brought no comfort. Ah, you're beginning to understand, young man. The watch wasn't made to change fate. It simply allows you to relive it, over and over, with slight variations. You can't avoid death, Daniel, only delay it. And what's worse, the more you fight against time, the more trapped you become in this cycle. Daniel felt a chill. He slowly sat in a nearby chair, trying to process what he had just heard. So, there's no way out? He could barely get the words out. McKenna shrugged, his expression neutral. The right question is, how far are you willing to go? The answer is already inside you, Daniel. You would sacrifice everything for her, wouldn't you? The antique dealer stood up and walked to a shelf in the back of the shop. When he returned, he held a small wooden box. He opened it and pulled out an old, yellow piece of paper, handing it to Daniel. It was a page from an ancient book, with a detailed illustration of the watch. But what caught Daniel's attention was the caption, "Cycle of Sacrifice. When time is bargained, only one will pay the price." "This has happened before," McKenna said, watching Daniel's confused expression. "This watch has passed through many hands before Daniel's, and it will pass through many more afterward. Everyone tries to save someone they love, but all of them end up trapped in the same cycle, sacrificing their lives to delay the inevitable." Daniel sat in silence, staring at the drawing of the watch on the page. "But what I don't understand," he finally spoke, his voice cracking, "is why it seems like Laura is suffering the consequences too. She never used the watch. How is she dying like this?" McKenna studied him for a moment, his expression softer than before. "Maybe you don't know the whole story." Those words echoed in Daniel's mind as he returned home. There was something he didn't know. Something Laura knew but hadn't told him. When he arrived at the apartment, he found Laura lying on the couch, looking exhausted, her eyes closed. She slowly opened them when she sensed his presence and tried to smile, but the pain was evident in her face. "You look so tired, Daniel," she said softly, her thin fingers reaching out to touch his hand. "Is everything okay?" He hesitated for a moment but then sat next to her, gently holding her hand. "Laura, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice low, as though the weight of the question might shatter the fragile atmosphere around them. "Did you know about the watch from the beginning?" Laura looked at him in surprise, and after a long silence, she turned her gaze away. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she slowly pulled her hand away. "I knew," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Not from the beginning, but I knew something like this was going to happen." Daniel felt his stomach churn. She knew. But how? And why? Laura hesitated. "Daniel, when we first met, years ago, something happened to me. I used the watch too. I found it before you did. I used it to save your life." Daniel's eyes widened, shock and confusion suffocating him. Laura continued, her voice low, as if remembering it was too painful. "You had an accident, years ago, and I used the watch to bring you back. But the price was my health. That's when the illness started. I never told you because, how could I? I couldn't lose you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel finally understood. They were trapped in a cycle of sacrifices. He had been trying to save Laura, but she had started it, sacrificing herself for him. "So the watch," Daniel murmured. "It's destroying us both, little by little." Laura nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It doesn't matter how much we try to change things, Daniel. The price is always the same. Someone has to pay." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the watch in his pocket like a sentence. He couldn't save Laura without losing everything. Maybe he couldn't save her at all. The silence in the apartment weighed heavily on Daniel, like a thick fog. He paced back and forth, Laura's words echoing in his mind. She had used the watch to save his life. Every beat of his heart was a reminder that Laura had sacrificed her own health for him. And now, he was doing the same, but the cost was greater than he ever imagined. Daniel sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the watch he held tightly in his hands. The cold metal seemed to pulse, as if it carried the weight of every year he had already lost. Laura's revelation had changed everything. They were both trapped in this cycle of sacrifice, each trying to save the other, but never escaping the fatal price the watch demanded. As he looked at the object, a desperate idea began to form in his mind. If all his previous attempts to prevent Laura's death had failed, maybe the solution wasn't to save her in the present, but to stop them from ever meeting in the first place. If he could go back in time, before their paths crossed, before she had the chance to use the watch to save his life, maybe he could break the cycle. They would never meet, she wouldn't have to sacrifice herself, and all of this would end. He knew it was an unthinkable idea, but he also knew that he couldn't keep losing everything to save someone who was already doomed. Daniel took a deep breath and stood up, determined. There was only one way to find out if this would work. Laura, I'm going out for a while, he said tensely as he passed through the living room. She looked up, tired, from the couch. Where are you going? Her voice sounded worried, but weak. Daniel forced a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. I just need to take care of something. I won't be long. Laura watched him for a moment, as if she knew he was hiding something, but nodded slowly. Daniel grabbed his coat and left, the watch already clenched tightly in his hand. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Outside, the streets were deserted. The city seemed strangely quiet, as if the world was bracing itself for what he was about to do. Daniel walked away, heading to a nearby park where he used to think, far from everything. When he arrived, he sat down on a lone bench under a tree and stayed there, staring at the watch. His breath came out shallow as he turned the hand. This time, he was going further back than before. He wanted to return to the moment before he met Laura, before their lives had become intertwined. If he could stop that first encounter, everything would be resolved. The familiar coldness wrapped around his body, and the world around him began to dissolve, distorting as he was pulled back through time. The feeling of emptiness consumed him, and for a brief moment, Daniel thought everything might be falling apart. When he opened his eyes, he was in the past. Not a recent past, but 5 years earlier. He stood on a busy street, exactly where he had met Laura for the first time. That day, she had almost been hit by a taxi, and Daniel had pulled her to safety at the last second. That was how it all began. That's when their lives had crossed. Now he was back at that critical moment. He saw Laura in the distance, walking toward the street, unaware of the danger that was approaching. The taxi was coming, just like he remembered. His heart raced, sweat dripping from his temples. This was his chance to end it all. But as the moment drew closer, something inside him began to falter. Was this really what he wanted? Daniel knew that if he let the accident happen, Laura would die that day. There would be no sacrifice on her part to save him, no cycle of pain and loss. She simply wouldn't exist in his life. But he also knew that all the memories, the smiles, the conversations, and the love they had shared would disappear forever. The seconds seemed to stretch out as Daniel fought with himself. He watched as Laura drew nearer to the street, the taxi getting closer. This was his chance to end everything. But deep down, he knew the truth. No matter how much he wanted to break the cycle, he couldn't turn away from the one person who truly meant something to him. When the taxi reached the point where it would almost hit Laura, Daniel moved without thinking. He ran toward her and pulled her back once again, just as he had the first time. She fell into his arms, startled and out of breath. "Oh my God! You saved me!" she said, laughing nervously as she stood up. Daniel looked at her, unable to say anything. He had made his choice. He couldn't lose Laura, even if it meant sacrificing himself. The watch had pulled him into this cycle, but the love he felt for her was stronger than any curse. He knew this wouldn't end here, but he wasn't ready to let her go. "Are you okay?" he asked, forcing a smile. "Yes, I didn't even see the taxi coming," Laura replied, still a little shaken. They stared at each other for a moment, and Daniel knew that, regardless of everything, some things are impossible to change. Even if he had the chance to stop fate, the love he felt for her would always lead him to act the same way, every time. When Daniel returned to the present, he felt an overwhelming exhaustion in every cell of his body. The time travel had drained him more than he expected. Looking at himself in the hallway mirror of his apartment, he saw new wrinkles and the pallor of his skin. He was aging quickly. The years he had lost were starting to show in terrifying ways. Laura was in the bedroom, asleep. Her breathing was uneven, growing weaker by the day. The watch now sat on the table between them, a constant reminder of the sacrifice that bound them. They had both paid a price, but the debt seemed endless. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, watching her. Even in her illness, her face still held that peaceful expression he had always loved. He wanted to save her more than anything, but now he understood the true cost. The cycle couldn't be broken, only prolonged. Laura's health was deteriorating rapidly, and the watch couldn't heal what was destroying her from within. Tears welled up in his eyes, the hopelessness growing stronger with each passing second. And then, he finally realized the truth he had been trying to avoid for so long: the only way to break the cycle was to let her go. He would never be ready for that, but he knew that prolonging her life with the watch would only condemn them further. In that moment, a new idea began to take shape. The watch worked on sacrifices, but it wasn't clear how far that power could go. Perhaps, with the right sacrifice, he could free them both from the chains of time and suffering. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the choice he was about to make. "I'd do anything for you, Laura," he whispered, knowing she couldn't hear him in that moment. His eyes fell on the watch, lying still on the table. He picked it up, the familiar weight in his hands, and realized he was about to do something final. The ultimate sacrifice. With trembling fingers, he turned the hand one last time, not to go back in time, but to offer the rest of his life for Laura. He knew this would age him beyond the point of no return, but he had no other choice. Maybe he could bargain his own existence in exchange for hers. The air around him slowed down, and everything seemed to freeze for a moment. When the effect passed, Daniel opened his eyes slowly. He felt an overwhelming heaviness in his limbs, as though his very energy had been drained away. His muscles ached, and his body seemed decades older in a matter of seconds. He could barely stand. With great effort, he turned toward Laura, hoping to see some sign of improvement. Her breathing had steadied. The color was beginning to return to her face. For a moment, he believed that his plan had worked. She was alive. Daniel collapsed to his knees beside the bed, his strength completely gone. His heart beat slowly, his body too tired to keep fighting. But as he watched Laura recover, he felt a peace he had never known. He had succeeded. He had finally saved her. Laura opened her eyes slowly, as though waking from a long sleep. "Daniel?" Her voice was soft, confused, but full of life again. He smiled weakly, his face marked by the weight of time. "You're safe now," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Laura sat up in bed, still disoriented, but when she saw Daniel's condition, her eyes filled with panic. What did you do? She knew, somehow, what he had sacrificed. Daniel, what did you do? He tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. His vision blurred, the sound of her voice fading slowly. He could feel the world slipping away, but inside, there was peace. He had made the right choice. His body, now fragile and old, couldn't hold the weight of life any longer. And as he felt the last bit of energy drain from him, he smiled. He had saved her. For the last time. Laura held him, tears streaming down her face as she called his name. Daniel, please stay with me. She cried, desperate. But Daniel couldn't fight anymore. He knew he had made the right decision. His body, now frail and aged, couldn't bear the weight of life any longer. And as he felt his last bit of strength slip away, he smiled. He had saved her, one final time. The light around him began to fade, and the last sound he heard was Laura's voice calling him. But he was already at peace. The cycle had been broken, but the cost had been far too high. The sun was rising when Laura finally left the hospital. The soft morning breeze brushed through her hair as she looked toward the horizon, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Her body was stronger than it had been in months. She could breathe easily, walk without the crushing weight of the illness that had debilitated her for so long. Daniel had done it. But the price was steep. He was gone. As she thought of him, a sharp pain pierced her chest. She had never imagined he would do it, that he would sacrifice what was left of his life to save her. They had fought together, trapped in an impossible cycle, but in the end, he had found a way out. She was alive, but he was no more. Laura walked slowly to the antique shop, the place where everything had begun. Mr. McKenna's shop was still open, the little bell above the door chiming as she entered. McKenna was there, as always, behind the counter. His eyes, cold and calculating, rested on Laura with a mix of curiosity and expectation. So, he made the final sacrifice, McKenna said, with no emotion in his voice. Laura felt the anger surge within her. This man had known everything. He knew the consequences, the cycle that had trapped them, and yet he had never fully warned them. She stepped closer to the counter, fury visible in every step. You knew what this would do to him, didn't you? She accused, her voice trembling with indignation. You knew he'd end up like this. McKenna watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. I knew, he answered calmly. But so did he. Everyone who uses the watch eventually understands the price. And in the end, they all make their choices. Laura felt the tears burn in her eyes. She wanted to scream at him, to blame him for everything, but deep down, she knew Daniel had chosen this path on his own. He had decided to sacrifice her at one point, and then sacrifice himself to save her. It was a cycle of love and loss, and she was stuck in the middle of it. Why does this exist? She asked softly, exhaustion evident in her voice. This watch, why do you keep it here? McKenna sighed and leaned forward, as if about to share a very old secret. The watch has been here for centuries, Laura. It has passed through the hands of many before Daniel, and it will pass through the hands of many more after him. Each person gets the chance to change something, but time always demands its price. No matter how many times you try to manipulate fate, in the end, the cost is always greater than you expect. He looked at her with a chilling glint in his eyes. And some people are willing to pay that price. Daniel was. And so were you. Laura shook her head, refusing to accept that fatalistic view. She couldn't accept that everything was inevitable, that people were destined to suffer endlessly. But at the same time, she knew McKenna was right in one regard: time was never defeated, only negotiated. She looked at the watch, still sitting on the counter, the very piece responsible for all the chaos that had consumed their lives. For a moment, she thought about destroying it, ending the cycle once and for all. But deep down, she knew the watch couldn't be destroyed so easily. It was a curse that went beyond anyone's power. It wasn't just an object, it was a concept, proof that fate always found a way to collect its dues. Laura picked up the watch, holding it for a moment, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. She knew she couldn't use it again. The temptation was strong, but the cost was far too great. The cycle had to end with her. Without saying a word, she placed it back on the counter. No one else should ever have this, she said firmly. McKenna merely shrugged, the cold smile still on his face. The watch always finds its way back. No matter how many times people try to get rid of it. It belongs to time. And time, as you've learned, never surrenders. Laura walked out of the shop without looking back. She knew her fight with the watch was over. Daniel was gone, but his sacrifice had freed her, and now she had to continue, live for him. No more watches, no more time travel. But the world was a strange place, and fate had its own ways of playing with those who thought they were in control. A few weeks later. A little girl with curly brown hair walked hand in hand with her mother down the street. Her curious eyes lit up as she looked at the storefronts. She stopped in front of the antique shop, staring through the window. Her eyes widened when she saw something shining in the shadows. "Mommy, look!" the girl exclaimed, pointing. "What a beautiful watch!" Her mother glanced quickly, smiling indulgently. "Yes, honey. But we're running late. Let's go!" Reluctantly, the girl gave the watch one last glance before following her mother down the busy street. Inside the shop, McKenna stood in the doorway, watching. The watch gleamed softly under the faint light. The cycle was far from over. There was always someone else willing to pay the price.